Good day, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Dr. Chijioke. The title of my topic is A Comparative Evaluation of the Effect of the Outbreak of COVID-19 on Selected Legal Rights in Nigeria. The paper discusses the effects of the pandemic on fundamental rights as well as other legal rights in Nigeria. And for purposes of clearer understanding, this paper has gone ahead to clarify some certain concepts applied in the work, and they are human rights, coronavirus, crisis, lockdown, isolation, quarantine, pandemic, and social distancing. Chapter 4 of the Nigerian Constitution provides for 12 fundamental rights which are justiciable under the laws of Nigeria, while Chapter 2 provides for some rights that are not justiciable. They are regarded as mere objective or aspirations of the state policy. Talking about the right to Medicare, because of the sordid state of Nigerian hospitals, the coronavirus issue came to Nigeria as a mark of surprise, and then as such, citizens could not access adequate Medicare, and then as such, we can say that this right has been denied citizens in Nigeria. Freedom from discrimination. Citizens of Nigeria who were infected by this disease were protected in such a manner that their names were not mentioned, or their names are not allowed to be mentioned publicly by the Nigerian government as a way of protecting them from discrimination. We are aware that record has it that in some parts of the world, the Asians are being discriminated against because the virus is believed to have originated from Wuhan in China. And that being the case, that has been responsible for the large scale of discriminatory practices against the Asians. The right to acquire and own immovable property in Nigeria has also been violated by both government officials and by the government itself. An example is the Rivers State government in Nigeria that pulled down a hotel on the ground that the proprietor of the hotel defaulted in one of the regulations meant to check the widespread of the disease. The pulling down of this hotel has been widely condemned as not having been done pursuant to the extant provisions of the law. Freedom of expression and the press. Fake news abound in Nigeria concerning the outbreak and the effects as a result of lack of information on the part of the government. Government has not done well to disseminate useful information to the citizenry, and then as a result of it, fake information has been the order of the day, especially on social media. And when this is the case, we cannot say that people are enjoying their right to freedom of the press. Why? Because the government has failed in this area. Again, we can talk about the right to personal liberty. The right to personal liberty in Nigeria has also been grossly undermined. Regulations made by government pursuant to Quarantine Act manifest the propensity of adversely affecting this right. This is because overzealous security operatives and enforcement agencies have most flagrantly abused this right. They arrest and detain people without justifiable reasons. One can also cite instances of the case of detainees in Cambodia. The same thing is happening in Nigeria, where we have unnecessary arrests, unjustifiable arrests. Freedom of movement. Failure to ease lockdown when necessary restricted and violated the enjoyment of this right by citizens of Nigeria. The authority that is responsible for this is the government agencies, the government security agencies. They are in the habit of restricting people's movement, even though the law allows those on essential services to go about their businesses. Report has it that even essential workers have been arrested and harassed severally by security forces of the Nigerian government. This is, of course, reprehensible. The right to dignity of human person is another right, fundamental right, that has been flagrantly abused. Defaulters of the lockdown directive are detained in crowded police cells And when this is done, we'll discover that even their right is not being taken into consideration. They are being dehumanized. How would you detain somebody who is not infected with the disease with other people who you do not even know whether or not they're infected with the disease, as a result of the government failure to even test people before they detain them? The same thing can be said of our correctional centers, where people are detained or inmates sent in without proper testing or without even testing. The prisons are crowded in such a manner that it is debasing and actually violates the right to dignity of human person of the inmate. Talking about right to education, which is also a second generation right, as can be found under Chapter 2 of the Constitution of the Federal Republic of Nigeria, we can say that the regulations put in place to tackle spread of the pandemic have created inadequate and unequal educational opportunities. Students have been kept at home for too long without serious arrangements for continuous education or plan to get them back to school soonest. And those schools that have embarked on online lecturing, they have done so in such a manner that most students are not beneficiaries of this scheme. Why? Because you need to have a smartphone to be able to do this. You need to also have data to be able to join in the lectures. And then we can also talk about the students in rural areas where poor network inhibit their right to enjoy this freedom or enjoy their right to education. In this wise, we can say that the right, this basic right, has been violated. We can also talk about the right to wages. There is no law in Nigeria that entitles an employer of labor to wage cuts. But because of this pandemic, there has been incidents of employers cutting the wages of their workers. There has been incidents of workers being rendered redundant. There has been incidents of job loss. And one can say, yeah, this is global, as it even affects the youth. But then the question is it not possible for this pandemic to be managed without actually affecting this right? But even if the negative is the answer, the fact remains that this pandemic has adversely affected the right of the worker to wages. Now, the right to good environment is also another area that has been adversely affected by the outbreak of the coronavirus. We can talk about agriculture and food. The lack of activities occasioned by the lockdown rules has made it impossible for farmers to go back to farm and cultivate in order to ensure increase in food production. By this, we can say that the pandemic has affected this aspect of our environment. We can also talk about the climate change, especially in Nigeria, where the industries are redundant, the factories have not been working. This has resulted in reduction in industrial activities, as a result of which we can boast of reduction in particulate matters and the level of pollution in Nigeria on the positive side. Now, having looked at this, these are the summary of the impact of the pandemic on the fundamental rights and some basic rights in Nigeria. The paper went ahead to make some recommendations. 1, government should ensure adequate dissemination of information and refrain from suppressing the right to freedom of information and the press. 2, government should make available information on COVID-19 pandemic in multiple ethnic languages for proper understanding, especially by those who are illiterate. 3, law enforcement officers who violate people's rights should be adequately punished. 4, government should be held responsible for violating people's right to acquire and own immovable property without due legal process. Right to freedom of movement and personal liberty should only be curtailed when legally justifiable and under instances that are reasonable. Government should ease lockdown as often as possible so as to ameliorate the sufferings of the citizens. 7, government should make available adequate palliative and economic stimulus packages to citizens during lockdown. Our hospitals must, as a matter of urgency and necessity, be upgraded if we have to curb the widespread of this pandemic. 9, the gains so far recorded in handling climate change in Nigeria must be sustained. There is need for urgent police cell and prison decongestion, In other words, the correctional facilities in Nigeria ought to be decongested in view of the pandemic and the implication, the effects of this very pandemic. 11. Rules of natural justice must be observed by government and security agencies. Bailout of employers of labor is necessary to ensure job security. And finally, the bill on infectious diseases should be discarded or extensively amended to be in consonant with what a democratic society requires. We therefore conclude that the pandemic has had adverse effects on fundamental rights as well as other basic legal rights.